Now, while it is easy to groan at every new horror remake announcement, it's also fair to say that some of them do prove pleasantly surprising when placed in the hands of talented filmmakers working with a committed cast. All the same, sometimes a remake is announced that just makes you ask, well, why? So on that positive note, I am Gareth, this is What Culture Horror, and here are 10 upcoming horror remakes nobody asked for. Number 10, The Blob. The Chuck Russell-directed, Frank Darabont-penned 1988 remake of The Blob is perhaps the most underappreciated horror remake of all time, injecting its quaint, even corny predecessor with a double dose of brutality, by way of some astonishing creature effects and an anything-goes attitude to its victims. Yeah, despite the '88 film flopping at the box office, earlier this year it was confirmed that a new version of The Blob is in development, with David Bruckner, who directed 2022's Hellraiser remake, set to write and direct. It's incredibly difficult to picture a new take on The Blob retaining the same wild, unforgiving edginess of Russell's previous remake though. And despite producer Kevin Levine insisting this new film will respect the practical effects lineage of its predecessor, it is hard to believe it won't go the mostly CGI route. Bruckner's a talented filmmaker, no question, but aren't his skills better spent on an original idea instead? Now I want to know, what horror remake do you think is severely underrated? Or which one do you just think's the best? You let me know in the comments section down below. Number 9, Possession. Andrei Solowski's 1981 horror classic Possession is a true one-of-a-kind. A cerebral, psychological horror that was elevated years before that dubious term ever existed. A mesmerizing fusion of relationship drama and body horror flick, Possession has remained an all-timer for horror fans keen to veer from the norm, in large part due to stunning performances from Sam Neill and especially an unforgettable Isabelle Adjani. Possession's bold, not remotely mainstream execution made it seem pretty safe from the remake treatment then. But in addition to an Indonesian remake being released earlier this year, it was also recently confirmed that a Hollywood retelling is indeed in the works. While few fans of the original were asking for a new rendition, it becomes a little trickier to dismiss out of hand given that it's set to star Robert Pattinson, while being written and directed by Parker Finn, the filmmaker behind the Smile franchise. Both Smile movies punched far above their weight in basically every respect, and considering how enthusiastically Finn has spoken about the original Possession in interviews, it actually seems like this could be a worthy remake, even if nobody was actually demanding it. Number 8, The Last Train to New York. Train to Busan is one of the most unforgettable horror films of the past decade, a rare zombie movie that feels genuinely fresh and intense, all while retaining a devastating emotional core. With the South Korean horror being an international smash hit, it wasn't remotely surprising that an English-language remake was announced the very same year it came out. Indonesian director Timo Tjahjanto, director of The Night Comes For Us, was later confirmed to direct a script written by Gary Doberman, who co-wrote it, while James Wan will produce. The remake, entitled The Last Train to New York, was originally set to release in 2023, yet the production ended up missing this date, and Warner Brothers hasn't yet announced a new schedule for shooting or release. But in an era where a non-English language film can win the Best Picture Oscar and Squid Game is one of the decade's most popular TV shows, it seems hilariously redundant to even bother remaking a movie as fundamentally perfect as Train to Busan just for folk who still don't like reading subtitles. Bit of a waste of time. Number 7, Tourist Trap. 1979's Tourist Trap is a gross, genuinely unnerving slasher flick in which a group of youngsters are lured to a roadside museum and assailed by a psychokinetic serial killer who uses their powers to control the museum's creepy mannequins. Earlier this year, horror legend Barbara Crampton announced that she was producing a remake. And while details beyond this are thin on the ground at present, it's simply difficult to picture a new film recapturing the vile, grotty style and tone of the original, which was integral to its success. Furthermore, Tourist Trap was basically already remade anyway, as 2005's surprisingly solid House of Wax remake borrows liberally from it, what with its hapless victims similarly being turned into living attractions. Between this and how aggressively Tourist Trap is a film of its era, there's little enthusiasm for a new iteration, even with Crampton's involvement. It's hoping it's a pleasant surprise all the same. Number 6, Arachnophobia. 1990's Arachnophobia remains a terrifically spine-tingling sit all these years later. Frank Marshall's horror comedy creature feature making the absolute most of its top-draw cast, headlined by Jeff Daniels and John Goodman, and extensive practical effects, including actual spiders. A remake was first announced back in 2022, with Christopher Landon, director of Happy Death Day and Freaky, hired to write and direct the new take, while James Wan will produce and Marshall will serve as executive producer. It's all too easy to imagine an Arachnophobia remake that takes itself far too seriously though, which combined with the inevitable glut of CGI that will replace the original's practical effects, makes it tough to be enthusiastic about this one. While this certainly doesn't mean the new Arachnophobia will be bad, and we can't really criticize new films for not using real spiders, the original is well aged enough that this remake feels like nothing more than a studio poring over their back catalogue for modest hits they can rehash for a new generation. If you're finding this all quite interesting, then hit that subscribe button down below for more What Culture horror lists and other wonderful videos that will then become a part of your life. Number 5. Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Attack of the 50-Foot Woman may not be a great movie, but it is an iconic one, having been widely parodied and imitated across pop culture over the last 6+ decades. That is a long time. The indie sci-fi horror about a woman who is transformed into a giantess following an alien encounter was actually previously remade in 1993, with Christopher Guest, Daryl Hannah starring TV movie making a fair attempt to deliver a more feminist update. And more than 3 decades on, Hollywood is gearing up for another attempt, with Tim Burton in the early stages of developing a new remake to be written by Gillian Flynn, writer of Gone Girl and Sharp Objects. While Flynn is a solid writer and Burton proved with Beetlejuice that he still got it, it's still tough to picture a contemporary remake of Attack of the 50-Foot Woman that manages to both embrace its B-movie origins and do something fresh with the story's feminist perspective. Some films are just better off left where they are, really, and this is most likely one of them. Number 4. House on Haunted Hill. 1959's Vincent Price starring House on Haunted Hill has already been remade once, with 1999's reimagining scoring mostly negative reviews upon release, though being more fondly regarded by audiences as a campy rollercoaster ride, enough that it lives on today as something of a bonkers cult hit. Yet with the 59 original being in the public domain, it's perhaps surprising that Hollywood's waited so long to take another crack at it. But indeed, filmmaker Dustin Ferguson, director of Spider Baby, is currently in production on a second remake, which will star Dan Roebuck and is being executive produced by Vincent Price's daughter Victoria, who will also have a role in the film. The 2 prior versions of the story are basically 2 sides of the same riotous coin, and so enthusiasm for a third take just isn't there, like at all. The 99 film is still a blast to watch, late 90s horror tropes notwithstanding, and so what can a contemporary version really bring to the mix? We'll have to wait and see, I guess. Number 3. The Trip. By far the least known horror film on this list, The Trip is a Norwegian black horror comedy from Tommy Wirkola, director of Dead Snow and Violent Night, starring Axel Hennie and Noomi Rapace as a dissatisfied couple who head to their cabin for the weekend, each unaware that the other is planning to kill them. Though solidly acclaimed by critics, The Trip was listlessly dumped on Netflix with little fanfare in 2021, such that it's flown frustratingly under the radar ever since. But rather than signal boost the original, naturally Hollywood decided to just remake it in English for a broader audience instead, with the recent announcement that Jorma Taccone, director of MacGruber and pop star Never Stop Never Stopping, will helm a new version starring Jason Segel, Samara Weaving, Timothy Oliphant, and Juliette Lewis. Now, as appealing as that cast might be, the original film is such a well-crafted and entertaining piece of work and one that desperately needs more eyes on it, that this remake is only likely to further limit its visibility, beyond those few curious enough to check out the original after the higher profile remake drops. Number 2. Idle Hands. Idle Hands is truly one of the most hilariously bizarre horror comedies ever made. A very late 90s teen horror in which a young slacker's hand becomes possessed and embarks on a killing spree. Though panned by critics at the time, Idle Hands has endured as a cult favourite for a whole quarter century, largely due to its outrageous tone, killer cast, including the likes of Devon Sawa, Seth Green, Jessica Alba, Eldon Henson, Vivica A. Fox, and Fred Willard, and a totally unforgettable cameo by punk rock legends The Offspring. But back in November, it was confirmed that filmmaker Jason Reitman, director of Ghostbusters Afterlife, will produce a remake, to be written and directed by Finn Wolfhard and Billy Brick. The remake has been dubbed a completely original take on idle hands that captures a disaffected generation. But recapturing the very of its time charms of the original is going to be extremely difficult. Given that the 1999 film remains popular with horror fans 25 years later, this remake just feels rather redundant really, even with some evidently talented folk working on it. Number 1. Witchboard. Not content to have his own remake of the Blob remade, director Chuck Russell has himself embarked on a remake of Witchboard, the 1986 supernatural horror about a college student who is terrorized by a malevolent entity after using a Ouija board. While hardly a critical success, the original Witchboard performed modestly well at the box office, and has sustained a cult following ever since release, albeit hardly on the level of most of the movies on this list, and so it just didn't seem like a prime prospect for the remake treatment, especially given that Hollywood released the similarly themed horror Ouija a decade ago. Credit where it's due though, while nobody was really asking for a new Witchboard, early festival reviews have largely praised it as a worthy redo, noting Russell's canny decision to lean into the camp rather than reimagine the story more seriously. Nobody was asking for this, but it sure sounds like the filmmakers got away with it. Just because we didn't ask for it does not mean it's not going to be any good, folks. Just remember that.